Long before silk traveled west toward Rome, footsteps were already crossing the mountains and deserts that would one day connect half the ancient world. Across Central Asia, snow-covered ranges rose above dry valleys, grasslands stretched toward distant horizons, and scattered oases offered rare islands of water and shade. To modernize, much of this landscape can seem empty. Archaeology tells a different story. Beneath the soil, in ancient graves and ruined settlements, researchers have found objects whose materials came from places hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away, evidence that movement across Eurasia began long before the famous Silk Road received its name. Their pathways were fragile, changing with seasons, climate, conflict, and the experience of generations of travelers. These early journeys were not made along a single road. They followed rivers, mountain passes, seasonal grazing lands, and chains of settlements where travelers could rest, trade, and learn what lay ahead. Communities on the Eurasian steppe moved with herds across enormous distances, carrying skills and stories between regions. Horses gradually transformed the speed and range of travel, while wheeled vehicles, metalworking traditions, ornaments, and unfamiliar goods appeared far from their likely places of origin. Burial sites sometimes contain objects made from distant stone, shell, or metal, quiet clues that ancient communities were connected through networks far larger than any one village could see. This does not mean that merchants were already traveling directly from China to the Mediterranean in one continuous journey. The evidence suggests something more gradual. Goods could pass from one group to another, crossing landscapes through many separate exchanges. A valuable object might travel farther than the person who first carried it. Knowledge could move in the same way. Techniques for working bronze, caring for horses, weaving textiles, or navigating difficult terrain could spread from community to community without anyone understanding the full distance those ideas had traveled. The future Silk Road was therefore growing long before it became recognizable as a great international network. That realization changes the beginning of the story. The Silk Road was not invented in a single year, nor created by one emperor opening a path across an empty continent. It emerged from generations of people learning where water could be found, which passes remained open, where grass was available for animals, and which neighboring communities could offer safety or exchange. Each successful journey added another fragment of practical knowledge to an invisible map carried in memory. Yet movement alone did not create lasting power. Once travelers repeatedly used the same valleys, rivers, and oases, those places became valuable. Settlements controlling reliable water or narrow mountain passages could influence who moved through them and what goods changed hands. Over time, some grew into wealthy centers positioned between far larger civilizations. The roads existed first, but eventually, kingdoms learned to profit from them. And that leaves a quieter mystery waiting beyond the horizon. Who were the first rulers to understand that controlling a road could be almost as powerful as controlling an empire? Between the famous empires stood smaller kingdoms whose greatest source of power was something no emperor could easily move: the road itself. Across Central Asia, fertile river valleys and scattered oases formed narrow corridors through landscapes of mountains, steppe, and desert. Communities settled where water could support fields, animals, workshops, and markets. These places might appear remote on a modern map, yet for ancient travelers they were essential. A ruler who controlled a reliable river crossing, a mountain entrance, or a chain of wells could influence movement across an entire region without possessing vast armies associated with Persia or China. Archaeology has revealed how organized these societies could be. Excavations across Central Asian valleys have uncovered fortified settlements protected by walls, carefully maintained irrigation channels, agricultural districts, workshops, and burial grounds containing objects from different cultural traditions. Coins and imported goods show connections extending beyond local communities, while pottery, jewelry, weapons, and artistic styles reveal people absorbing influences without simply abandoning their own customs. The middle of Eurasia was therefore never an empty corridor through which greater civilizations passed. It contained societies with their own rulers, economies, beliefs, rivalries, and ambitions, each responding to the opportunities created by movement across the landscape. Geography could make even a modest kingdom surprisingly influential. Caravans could not cross every mountain wherever they wished, nor could animals survive indefinitely without water and grazing land. Travelers were drawn toward particular valleys and oasis settlements where supplies could be replaced and information gathered about conditions ahead. Markets grew around these points of necessity. Local rulers could protect merchants, collect duties, negotiate with neighboring powers, or attempt to control valuable passages. Their strength depended less upon conquering enormous territories than upon understanding the landscape around them. In this world, a narrow valley could matter more than hundreds of kilometers of empty desert. Geography shaped politics before distant emperors understood its value. Many of these regional powers remain unfamiliar today, because surviving histories often favor the great imperial courts surrounding them. Yet archaeological evidence restores some of the complexity that written chronicles overlooked. Central Asia was a political mosaic, repeatedly reshaped by migration, alliances, warfare, trade, and environmental change. Its inhabitants were not passive middlemen waiting for foreign merchants to arrive. They helped determine where routes developed, which markets prospered, and how objects and ideas moved between distant societies. Their forgotten cities were active crossroads, not merely stations between better-known worlds. Among these overlooked regions, one would become especially important. Between the Oxus and Jaxartes river systems lay fertile lands centered on cities that would later become famous, including Samarkand. This was Sogdiana, a world of prosperous settlements whose merchants eventually traveled far beyond their homeland. They would establish communities across Central Asia and into China, carrying goods, languages, stories, and beliefs with them. They rarely built a vast empire of their own. Instead, they discovered another form of influence. How did merchants from one relatively small region become some of the greatest connectors of the ancient world? They possessed no empire stretching from sea to sea, yet their language and merchants could be encountered thousands of kilometers from home. In the fertile valleys of Sogdiana, around cities such as Samarkand and Panjikent, communities developed at one of Central Asia's natural crossroads. The Sogdians were Iranian-speaking peoples whose homeland lay between great rivers and mountain systems, well placed for contact with surrounding worlds. Their political landscape was divided among local rulers and cities rather than united beneath one enduring imperial throne. Yet from this relatively small region emerged merchants whose commercial networks would become among the most influential along the Silk Road. Sogdian traders traveled east across Central Asia and established communities deep within China. They dealt in textiles, metals, precious materials, perfumes, spices, horses, and other valuable goods, although the cargo varied according to period and destination. Their greatest advantage may have been less tangible. Generations of long-distance commerce created knowledge of languages, markets, political conditions, routes, and trusted partners. A merchant arriving in an unfamiliar city did not always begin alone. Communities of fellow Sogdians could provide contacts and information, allowing networks to stretch across distances that no single ruler controlled. Commerce became a form of influence built not through conquest but through relationships maintained across generations. Some of the most remarkable evidence for this world survives not in royal monuments but in letters. In 1907, documents now known as the Ancient Letters were discovered near Dunhuang in western China. Written in Sogdian around the early 4th century, they reveal people living far from their homeland and communicating across immense distances. They discuss commercial affairs and political troubles, but one letter is especially personal. A woman named Miune, stranded far from home, wrote bitterly after being abandoned by her husband. Across roughly 16 centuries, her frustration survives with an immediacy that transforms the Silk Road from an abstract trade network into a landscape inhabited by vulnerable individuals. Such documents reveal the hidden cost of connectivity. Merchants could spend years away from families. Messages crossed dangerous territories slowly, if they arrived at all. Political upheaval in a distant city could destroy investments or separate communities without warning. Yet these risks did not prevent Sogdian networks from expanding. Their settlements became points where information and goods could move onward, linking societies whose inhabitants might never meet directly. A merchant could therefore connect worlds without personally traveling from one end of Eurasia to the other. The Sogdians reveal a different kind of ancient power. Their influence rested not on possessing the largest army, but on understanding how distant communities could be connected. With every journey they carried more than merchandise. Languages, religious beliefs, artistic traditions, stories, and news traveled beside their goods. Eventually, these influences appeared inside the homes, temples, and painted halls of Sogdian cities themselves. What did daily life look like in a society whose merchants had learned to bring distant worlds home? The Silk Road's greatest treasures were sometimes not buried beside the road, but painted across the walls of the homes surrounding it. At Panjikent, in present-day Tajikistan, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a Sogdian city whose houses, temples, streets, and reception rooms preserve an unusually intimate picture of urban life. Flourishing especially during the 5th to 8th centuries, Panjikent was not merely a stopping place for tired caravans. It was a sophisticated community where merchants, landowners, craftspeople, priests, servants, and families lived within a world enriched by both local traditions and distant connections. Inside some wealthy houses, walls once glowed with elaborate paintings. Their surviving fragments depict banquets, heroic tales, religious scenes, battles, processions, and stories whose meanings are sometimes still debated. These images reveal more than decoration. They show how Sogdian elites surrounded themselves with narratives about courage, belief, status, and memory. Archaeologists have also uncovered temples, workshops, storage spaces, household objects, and traces of food preparation. Together, these remains allow the city to emerge not as an abstract point on a trade map, but as a place where children grew up, meals were prepared, agreements were negotiated, and returning travelers brought news from beyond the horizon. Daily life depended upon work that rarely appears in grand histories. Craftspeople shaped pottery, metal, wood, and textiles. Farmers supported the city from cultivated land beyond its walls. Merchants organized goods and credit, while households managed supplies for relatives who might be absent for long periods. Religious life also reflected a complex Sogdian world. Local Iranian traditions remained important, while broader contacts exposed communities to Buddhism, Christianity, Manichaeism, and other beliefs moving across Eurasia. This diversity did not create one blended Silk Road culture. Instead, different traditions could coexist, overlap, and change, while communities continued expressing identities rooted in their own language and customs. That distinction is important. Trade did not simply make every city alike. Foreign objects and artistic influences could be adopted selectively, given new meanings, or placed beside older traditions. A motif arriving from another region might appear within a distinctly Sogdian story. Imported luxury goods could demonstrate wealth without replacing local tastes. The Silk Road connected societies precisely because different places remained different, giving travelers something valuable, unfamiliar, or meaningful to exchange. Cultural contact created layers rather than uniformity, leaving archaeologists a record of people continually choosing what to borrow and what to preserve. Panjikent therefore overturns the image of Silk Road settlements as dusty camps scattered between greater civilizations. Behind their walls were decorated rooms, ceremonies, workshops, family concerns, religious practices, and stories told across generations. Yet the city's prosperity depended upon a political landscape that never remained still. During the 8th century, Arab expansion and struggles across Central Asia transformed the world in which Sogdian cities had flourished. Their culture did not vanish at once, but old arrangements were changing. The merchants who had mastered distance now faced a different challenge. What happened when empires began competing more directly for the roads that had made these cities rich? The journey west began partly with a search for allies, but what Chinese envoys discovered was an entire political world beyond the frontier. During the 2nd century BCE, the Han dynasty faced persistent conflict with the Xiongnu, a powerful confederation dominating parts of the northern steppe. Emperor Wu sought partners who might help weaken this threat. Around 138 BCE, an official named Zhang Qian was sent west to contact the Yuezhi, a people who had themselves been displaced by the Xiongnu. The mission would become famous, although almost nothing about it unfolded according to plan. Zhang Qian was captured by the Xiongnu and detained for years before escaping and continuing westward. When he finally reached Central Asia, he encountered established societies that Chinese imperial authorities knew only imperfectly. His reports described places including Dayuan in the Fergana Valley, Daxia in Bactria, and other lands connected through existing networks of exchange. Markets contained goods traveling between regions, while agricultural communities and cities revealed a world far more settled and interconnected than distant observers might have imagined. Zhang Qian had not discovered an empty route waiting to be opened. He had entered networks that local peoples had already been using for generations. Among the discoveries that attracted Han attention were the celebrated horses associated with Daoyuan. Chinese sources admired these powerful animals, later remembered through descriptions of extraordinary heavenly horses. Their reputation was tied to military concerns, since strong Central Asian horses could strengthen cavalry forces confronting enemies on the frontier. Han attempts to obtain them eventually contributed to military campaigns against Daoyuan around the beginning of the 1st century BCE. A commodity desired for its practical and symbolic value had become important enough to influence diplomacy and warfare across enormous distances. Han involvement in Central Asia subsequently expanded through missions, alliances, military activity, and competition over strategic territories. Chinese silk also traveled increasingly westward, although often through many intermediaries rather than merchants completing one uninterrupted journey. The process did not create the Silk Road from nothing. Instead, imperial ambitions became attached to older paths shaped by pastoral communities, oasis settlements, traders, and regional kingdoms. What had once been a collection of overlapping exchanges was becoming more deeply entangled with the strategic interests of powerful states. This was a decisive change. The roads could carry luxury goods, but they could also carry intelligence about rival kingdoms, potential allies, military resources, and political instability. Geography that had enriched small oasis powers could now attract armies from far away. Yet Han influence had limits. Beyond every frontier stood societies with their own rulers and ambitions, and no emperor could simply command the entire continent. Farther west and south, migrations and political upheaval were creating another powerful state across Central Asia and northern India. Its rulers would occupy a remarkable meeting point between civilizations. What could happen when an empire controlled not one distant road, but several of Eurasia's greatest crossroads at once? A merchant might carry silk across a mountain pass, but beside him could travel something impossible to weigh: a new understanding of the universe. During the first centuries of the Common Era, the Kushan Empire emerged across territories linking Central Asia with Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northern India. Its origins lay among the Yuezhi groups who had moved westward after upheavals farther east. From these migrations developed a powerful state, positioned between several cultural worlds. Kushan geography became one of its greatest advantages, connecting routes toward China and Central Asia with the rich cities and markets of South Asia and Iran. Archaeology reveals just how diverse this empire became. Kushan rulers issued abundant coins carrying royal portraits and images of deities drawn from several religious traditions. Greek letters appeared on many coins, while later issues also used Bactrian, an Iranian language written in Greek script. The divine figures represented could draw upon Iranian, Indian, Greek, and other traditions. These coins were political objects, rather than simple mirrors of everyday belief. Yet their imagery shows rulers communicating across a society where different cultural traditions met. Inscriptions, sculptures, monasteries, and excavated settlements add further evidence of an empire shaped by movement and exchange. This interconnected world flourished especially under rulers such as Kanishka, whose reign probably began in the 2nd century, although scholars continue debating its exact chronology. Buddhist traditions later remembered him as an important patron, and Kushan territories became closely associated with major centers of Buddhist learning and artistic production. In regions such as Gandhara, sculptors created striking Buddhist images within an artistic environment influenced by several traditions. These works were not merely foreign styles copied unchanged. Local artists transformed inherited forms into something distinctive, demonstrating how cultural exchange could produce new expressions rather than erase older identities. Buddhism itself was also moving. Monks, travelers, merchants, manuscripts, and teachings followed networks connecting South and Central Asia with communities farther east. The process unfolded over centuries and involved many peoples beyond the Kushan Empire, but commercial routes helped provide channels through which religious ideas could travel. A caravan carrying textiles or precious goods might move through the same landscape as a monk seeking another monastery. Material trade and spiritual exchange occupied overlapping worlds. The Silk Road was becoming a network through which societies could encounter not only unfamiliar objects, but unfamiliar explanations of life, suffering, morality, and existence. Kushan political power eventually fragmented, challenged by changing dynasties and regional forces. Yet the ideas passing through Kushan territory did not disappear with its rulers. Buddhist communities continued spreading across Central Asia, leaving monasteries, paintings, sculptures, and manuscripts in places far beyond the empire's former boundaries. Here lay a quieter form of historical power. A kingdom could vanish while something carried through it continued traveling for centuries. Ahead, around the edges of one of Asia's harshest deserts, abandoned cities would preserve evidence of exactly that journey. Could ideas ultimately travel farther than the empires that once helped carry them? In one of Earth's harshest deserts, the most valuable possession was not always silk, jade, or gold. Sometimes it was simply water. Across the Tarim Basin, the Taklamakan Desert stretches beneath a dry horizon, enclosed by some of the highest mountain systems on Earth. Travelers attempting to move between Central Asia and China faced a landscape where distance could become deadly. Rather than crossing the desert's interior as though following a highway, routes generally developed around its northern and southern margins. There, rivers descending from snow-covered mountains created scattered oases where fields could grow, animals could drink, and cities could survive. These pockets of fertile land became essential links in long-distance exchange. Travelers moved from oasis to oasis, depending upon communities that understood how to manage limited water. Irrigation channels carried meltwater toward orchards and fields, supporting settlements beside an environment that could not sustain them without careful organization. Geography gave these communities unusual influence. A kingdom did not need to control thousands of kilometers of desert. If it controlled reliable water along a useful route, travelers had powerful reasons to enter its markets, negotiate with its authorities, and depend upon its supplies. Among the most important southern oasis kingdoms was Khotan. Situated where routes connected the Tarim Basin with regions farther west and south, Khotan became famous for jade, particularly material carried from nearby river systems and valued in China for centuries. Yet jade was only part of its importance. Khotan also developed into a significant Buddhist center. Historical accounts, manuscripts, religious remains, and artistic evidence reveal connections with India, Central Asia, and China. Languages, beliefs, goods, and artistic traditions crossed through the oasis, making a settlement surrounded by desert part of an international cultural world. Archaeology across the wider Tarim Basin has revealed how rich that world could be. Abandoned settlements and religious sites have yielded manuscripts in multiple languages, fragments of textiles, wooden objects, paintings, household possessions, and traces of agricultural life. These discoveries challenge any image of desert communities as temporary camps. People built houses, cultivated land, practiced religions, raised families, administered kingdoms, and maintained networks connecting them with distant societies. The desert isolated these settlements geographically, yet the roads running around it made some of them remarkably cosmopolitan. Their survival, however, rested upon a delicate foundation. Rivers could alter course, irrigation systems could fail, political power could shift, and merchants could begin favoring different routes. A settlement that had prospered because travelers needed its water might decline when environmental or political conditions changed. Some communities endured through repeated transformations. Others were gradually abandoned until sand entered streets that had once carried merchants and pilgrims. Yet disappearance did not erase everything. The same dry climate that made survival difficult could preserve wood, textiles, documents, and ordinary belongings for centuries. Why did some cities survive while others fell silent? And what might their abandoned rooms reveal about the people who never returned? The desert destroyed roots, emptied settlements, and buried homes, yet in doing so, it preserved voices that history might otherwise have lost forever. Along the southern Tarim Basin, abandoned sites survived in conditions so dry that materials normally consumed by moisture and decay remained beneath the sand. Wooden objects, fragments of cloth, documents, food remains, and pieces of architecture waded through centuries of silence. When archaeologists began examining these places, they found something more revealing than treasure. They encountered traces of ordinary lives, interrupted in settlements that had once belonged to a busy world of agriculture, administration, religion, and long-distance exchange. Nia offers one of the most remarkable examples. Once associated with the ancient kingdom of Croraina, the settlement lay near waterways that supported cultivation beside the desert. Archaeologists uncovered houses constructed with timber and mud materials, orchards and agricultural remains, furniture, textiles, and numerous documents written on wooden tablets. Many used the Kharosthi script, whose presence reflects connections with cultural traditions extending toward the northwest of the Indian subcontinent. Chinese documents and other finds reveal additional influences. Here, beside the Taklamakan, different systems of writing and administration met within a community whose residents were connected to worlds far beyond their fields. The surviving documents make that vanished society unusually intimate. They concern taxation, property, official orders, disputes, travel, and other practical matters that rarely appear in monumental inscriptions. Sand also preserved footwear, woven materials, wooden utensils, and remnants of food. None were intended to survive as messages to the future. Their importance comes precisely from their ordinariness. A shoe records the shape of someone who walked through these streets. A document preserves a disagreement that once mattered urgently to people now forgotten. A piece of cloth recalls hands that produced, repaired, wore, and finally abandoned it. Nia's decline was probably connected to changing environmental and political conditions, although reconstructing exactly how and when communities withdrew remains difficult. Water was fundamental. When river systems shifted or irrigation became harder to sustain, settlements built within fragile desert environments could lose their foundations. Changing political structures and trade patterns could deepen those pressures. Abandonment was therefore rarely a single dramatic moment. A city could become quieter gradually, until houses stood empty and sand began entering rooms where families had once gathered. Yet the disappearance of such communities reveals something larger. Kingdoms could vanish while ideas moving through them continued onward. Buddhist traditions, artistic forms, languages, technologies, and stories crossed boundaries that political rulers could not preserve forever. The answer hinted at by the Kushan world was becoming clearer. Influence could survive territory. Still, desert settlements represented only part of this enormous network. Farther west stood a city where merchants, diplomats, craftspeople, and cultures converged on an extraordinary scale. To understand the Silk Road at its greatest urban crossroads, the journey must leave the Taklamakan and return toward Sogdiana. There, waiting beyond the mountains, was Samarkand. For centuries, travelers arrived from different directions, carrying different languages, religions, clothing, goods, and loyalties. And somehow, one city learned to receive them all. Samarkand stood within the fertile Zaravshan Valley, where geography placed it near routes leading toward China, India, Iran, the Eurasian steppe, and lands farther west. By the early medieval period, it had become one of Sogdiana's greatest urban centers. The roads encountered throughout this journey no longer seem like separate threads here. Around Samarkand, they begin to form a web, bringing merchants and diplomats into a city whose prosperity depended upon understanding distant worlds. Ancient Samarkand occupied the site now called Afrasiab, a vast archaeological area beside the modern city. Excavations have revealed defensive walls, streets, houses, workshops, and evidence of repeated rebuilding across centuries. The settlement scale reflects more than commercial importance. Samarkand was also a political center, ruled by local elites who negotiated with neighboring powers while benefiting from international exchange. Coins, ceramics, imported objects, and artistic remains demonstrate connections extending across Eurasia. Yet one discovery offers an especially vivid glimpse of the people who entered this cosmopolitan environment. During excavations in the 20th century, archaeologists uncovered remarkable 7th century wall paintings within an elite residence at Afrasiab. Although portions have been damaged or lost, surviving scenes show processions, ceremonies, and figures associated with different regions. One famous composition appears to depict foreign envoys approaching the ruler of Samarkand. Other imagery has been interpreted as representing connections with places including China and the Korean peninsula, although scholars continue debating details of individual figures and scenes. Whatever every image originally meant, the paintings present Samarkand as a city consciously imagining itself within an international political world. That discovery changes how the Silk Road can be pictured. Distant civilizations were not connected only because an object passed silently from merchant to merchant. People themselves traveled. Ambassadors entered foreign courts. Interpreters carried words between languages. Clothing, rituals, gestures, and gifts communicated identity before negotiations even began. A visitor from a distant kingdom could stand inside a Sogdian hall beneath paintings representing a world extending far beyond the city's walls. Geography had created a crossroads, but diplomacy transformed that crossroads into political influence. Samarkand's position also carried danger. The same roads that delivered wealth could bring armies, instability, and news of changing powers. A conflict hundreds of kilometers away might interrupt commerce. A new dynasty could alter alliances, while religious and political transformations could reshape communities that had flourished for generations. Samarkand survived many such changes, but the Sogdian world around it would not remain untouched. Across Central Asia, new powers were approaching, and the networks mastered by Sogdian merchants would soon operate beneath different rulers. What happened when the delicate balance that enriched Samarkand finally began to change? Empires could capture cities, and armies could seize mountain passes, but controlling the Silk Road was something far more difficult than conquering land. Across Central Asia, political boundaries repeatedly changed while merchants continued searching for markets, travelers followed water and shelter, and communities adjusted to new rulers. The Sogdian city-states, Kushan domains, oasis kingdoms, and regional powers encountered along the journey all transformed or disappeared. Yet their decline did not erase the connections they had helped create. Roads survived because the reasons for traveling them often survived the kingdoms responsible for protecting them. From the 6th century onward, Turkic powers expanded across much of Inner Asia, creating new political relationships between the steppe, Sogdiana, China, Iran, and other regions. Sogdian merchants proved especially adaptable within this changing world. Their commercial experience and international communities remained valuable under rulers whose military strength extended far beyond Sogdiana itself. Instead of requiring political independence to prosper, merchants could negotiate within new systems of authority. Alliances shifted and dynasties changed, but knowledge of languages, markets, routes, and distant partners remained useful. Influence could therefore continue even when political control belonged to someone else. Archaeology makes this continuity visible. Coins issued under different authorities circulated through familiar commercial landscapes. Artistic motifs crossed political boundaries and appeared in new settings. Religious communities established themselves far from the regions where their traditions had begun. Languages traveled with merchants and migrants, while imported objects continued arriving in cities ruled by changing dynasties. Political history often divides the past into neat periods named after kings and empires. Material evidence tells a less orderly story. Beneath each change of ruler were communities carrying habits, beliefs, skills, and relationships forward from an older world. This reveals the deeper answer to the question raised earlier by the Kushan Empire. Territory was not always the most enduring thing a Silk Road kingdom could leave behind. The Kushans fragmented, yet Buddhism continued traveling. Sogdian political independence weakened, yet Sogdian merchants remained active across distant regions. Desert kingdoms disappeared, while manuscripts preserved languages and beliefs that had once crossed their streets. The Silk Road's greatest legacy was not permanent control. It was connection that repeatedly survived the political structures surrounding it. That survival also makes the central mystery more difficult. If no empire could permanently possess these networks, who truly controlled them? Power belonged at different moments to rulers guarding passes, nomadic confederations commanding the steppe, cities controlling water, merchants organizing exchange, and communities maintaining knowledge of the journey ahead. Soon another transformation would reshape Central Asia, while Baghdad rose farther west, and new political worlds absorbed older roots. Centuries later, Mongol armies would redraw Eurasia on an extraordinary scale. Yet even they would discover that conquering territory and controlling human movement were not the same thing. Could anyone ever truly rule a road that belonged to so many worlds at once? The rulers changed, religions changed, and languages changed. But the caravans did not simply stop moving. During the 7th and 8th centuries, armies associated with the expanding Islamic caliphates moved eastward into territories long shaped by Iranian traditions, Turkic powers, Sogdian cities, Buddhist communities, and local religions. The conquest of Central Asia unfolded unevenly across decades rather than as one sudden transformation. Samarkand, Bukhara, and surrounding regions experienced warfare, rebellion, negotiation, and changing alliances. Political authority could shift quickly, but the deeper habits of a society, its language, beliefs, commercial relationships, and daily routines, were far more difficult to replace. Arab forces crossed the Oxus repeatedly before establishing firmer control over Transoxiana during the early 8th century. The campaigns associated with the governor Qutayba ibn Muslim brought Bukhara and Samarkand under Umayyad authority, although resistance and political instability continued. Written sources describe conflict, agreements, taxation, and local rulers adapting to new circumstances. Archaeology adds a quieter perspective. Coins, buildings, ceramics, artistic traditions, and religious evidence suggest continuity alongside change. Older communities remained present even as new institutions appeared. Islam spread gradually, and conversion across Central Asia was a complicated process extending over generations rather than occurring immediately after conquest. For the Sogdians, this transformation altered the political world that had supported their extraordinary commercial networks. Their city-states lost much of their independence, while older religious traditions eventually declined or changed. Yet Sogdian culture did not vanish when armies entered its cities. Sogdian merchants continued appearing far from home, particularly across routes toward China, while local craftspeople and families remained within communities undergoing gradual transformation. Languages overlapped. New beliefs existed beside older practices. The Silk Road had always depended upon adaptation, and once again, its inhabitants learned to live within political structures different from those their ancestors had known. The most important change was therefore not the destruction of long-distance exchange, but its integration into a widening commercial world. Under Islamic rule, Central Asian routes became increasingly connected with networks extending through Iran and Iraq toward markets much farther west. Merchants could participate in systems linking overland roads with maritime routes reaching the Indian Ocean. Goods, money, information, scholarship, and religious ideas continued moving, although the communities organizing that movement evolved. The roads survived because cities repeatedly found new reasons to remain connected. Something profound was nevertheless disappearing. The Sogdian language would gradually retreat, and the independent political world, represented by Old Samarkand and Panjikent, would become history. Yet commercial knowledge accumulated over centuries could not simply be erased. Merchants, translators, scholars, and craftspeople carried fragments of that older world into the new one. As Central Asia changed, another extraordinary center was rising farther west, drawing wealth and knowledge toward the banks of the Tigris. What would happen when the ancient roads of Eurasia became connected to the intellectual and commercial world of Baghdad? Some travelers carried objects worth fortunes. Others carried something that could be copied endlessly without becoming smaller: knowledge. In 762, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur founded Baghdad beside the Tigris River. Its position connected it with routes reaching Iran and Central Asia, while river and maritime networks opened toward the Persian Gulf and Indian Ocean. Within generations, Baghdad became one of the great cities of the medieval world, drawing merchants, administrators, craftspeople, scholars, and travelers from distant regions. The old roads of Central Asia now belong to a commercial system far larger than any single caravan route. Silk, spices, precious metals, textiles, ceramics, paper, and countless other goods circulated through this connected world. Yet information moved beside them. Scholars worked with mathematical knowledge developed in India, astronomical traditions inherited and expanded from several cultures, Greek philosophical and medical texts, Persian learning, and observations gathered within the Islamic world itself. Translation became particularly important under Abbasid patronage, especially during the 8th and 9th centuries. Works were translated into Arabic from languages including Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Sanskrit, creating opportunities for scholars to examine, criticize, preserve, and develop ideas inherited from different intellectual traditions. This process was not a simple movement of knowledge from east to west, or from one civilization into another. Baghdad's intellectual life depended upon people of varied religious, linguistic, and geographical backgrounds. Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and other scholars participated in wider traditions of scholarship and translation. Knowledge changed as it traveled. Mathematical methods could be refined, astronomical observations corrected, medical writings debated, and geographical understanding expanded through new reports. Like an imported artistic motif transformed by Sogdian painters, an idea arriving in Baghdad did not necessarily leave in the same form. Paper offers a striking example of how technologies could reshape intellectual exchange. Papermaking originated in China and gradually spread westward across Asia, becoming increasingly important in the Islamic world during the Abbasid period. Its adoption supported the production of books, records, letters, and scholarly works on a growing scale. The exact pathways of technological transmission were complex, but the result was profound. Knowledge could now be recorded and reproduced through a material that helped information travel across generations as well as geography. Here, the deeper legacy of the Silk Road becomes visible. Kingdoms vanished, yet a mathematical method could survive them. Languages declined, while texts translated from them entered new intellectual traditions. A traveler carrying a manuscript might influence people living centuries after his own name had disappeared, but these connections still depended upon routes remaining accessible enough for people to move. Eurasia remained divided among competing states, and periods of stability never lasted forever. During the 13th century, armies would emerge from the Mongolian grasslands and overturn kingdoms across an astonishing distance. Their conquests brought terrible destruction, yet what followed created a historical paradox. Could the armies that shattered old worlds eventually make distant worlds easier to connect? The armies that shattered old kingdoms would eventually help create conditions in which travelers crossed distances few earlier generations had attempted. At the beginning of the 13th century, the grasslands of Mongolia became the center of a political transformation. Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan, united many Mongol groups and directed their military power outward. Within decades, Mongol armies and those of his successors conquered territories stretching across much of Eurasia. The speed was extraordinary. Yet for many communities standing in their path, this expansion brought destruction on a scale that cannot be separated from the story of later connectivity. Central Asia experienced some of the most devastating campaigns. After relations between Genghis Khan and the Khwarezmian Empire collapsed, Mongol forces invaded in 1219. Major cities were attacked, populations suffered severely, and political structures that had governed important commercial regions were broken apart. Medieval accounts often provide dramatic casualty numbers that modern historians treat cautiously, but archaeological and written evidence leaves little doubt that warfare caused immense disruption. Irrigation systems and settlements in some regions suffered, communities were displaced, and established centers faced violence whose consequences could last for generations. The Silk Road was not peacefully unified. Its new political order emerged through conquest. Yet the consequences did not end with destruction. As Mongol rule expanded, and the empire later divided into successor khanates, enormous areas of Eurasia remained connected through related political systems. Mongol authorities valued merchants, diplomatic communication, skilled artisans, and information. Roads and relay networks supported official movement, while passports and forms of protection could assist authorized travelers. Merchants still faced robbery, weather, disease, local conflict, and political uncertainty, but some long-distance journeys became more practical within territories whose rulers maintained communication across remarkable distances. Historians sometimes describe these conditions as the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace. The phrase is useful only with caution. Eurasia did not become universally peaceful, and wars continued both within and between Mongol states. Nor did every traveler enjoy equal protection. What changed was the scale of political connection. Courts from East Asia to Western Eurasia could communicate through diplomatic missions, while merchants, religious figures, craftspeople, and specialists moved between regions that had once belonged to separate political worlds. Information could cross distances alongside people summoned, employed, displaced, or encouraged to travel. This is one of Silk Road history's most uncomfortable paradoxes. The conquests that devastated cities also helped create conditions for wider exchanges across the territories that survived them. Destruction and connection belong to the same historical transformation without canceling one another. As Mongol successor states stretched across Eurasia, written records began describing travelers appearing astonishingly far from home. Merchants followed opportunity, missionaries approached distant courts, and diplomats carried messages between rulers who had never met. Their journeys would leave unusually detailed accounts of the medieval world. But who were these travelers, and what did they actually encounter on roads now stretching across an empire of unprecedented scale? History remembers the names of a few famous travelers, but every famous journey depended upon hundreds of people whose names were never recorded. During the age of the Mongol successor states, diplomats, merchants, missionaries, artisans, and religious travelers crossed extraordinary distances. In the 1250s, the Franciscan William of Rubruck journeyed from the world of Western Christianity toward the Mongol court. His account described unfamiliar landscapes, communities, religions, and political customs. He traveled as an envoy, yet his survival depended upon guides, interpreters, local officials, animal handlers, and countless strangers who helped make movement across Eurasia possible. Marco Polo became the most celebrated European traveler associated with this interconnected world. According to the account traditionally linked to him, he left Venice in the 13th century with his father and uncle and traveled across Asia before spending years within territories ruled by Kublai Khan. Scholars have long debated particular details of the text, how it was composed, and the reliability of some descriptions. Yet its importance remains undeniable. The work presented generations of readers with an extraordinary picture of Asian cities, wealth, customs, landscapes, and political power, demonstrating how travel could transform distant places into imaginable worlds. Other travelers reveal different networks. In the 14th century, the Moroccan scholar Ibn Battuta crossed vast territories from North Africa through the Middle East, Central and South Asia, and beyond. His journeys belong to a somewhat later and different political landscape, but they demonstrate how religious, commercial, and scholarly connections continued enabling remarkable mobility. More important still were the thousands of merchants whose names rarely survived. Armenians, Persians, Central Asians, Chinese, Italians, and many other communities participated in overlapping networks, often traveling only portions of routes rather than crossing Eurasia completely. None of these journeys was easy. Mountains could close beneath winter snow, deserts demanded careful management of water, and animals weakened or died. Travelers faced illness, robbery, warfare, confusing borders, and unfamiliar languages. A successful caravan depended upon people who knew where wells could be found, which roads were safe, where taxes were collected, and which authorities controlled the next region. Interpreters made negotiation possible. Local merchants provided contacts. Inns and caravanserais offered shelter where available. Information gathered from travelers moving in the opposite direction could determine whether a journey continued or changed course. The famous explorer, then, was rarely an isolated figure walking bravely into the unknown. Long-distance travel rested upon an invisible infrastructure of ordinary expertise accumulated over centuries. Maps can make the Silk Road appear like a simple line across Eurasia, but nobody lived it that way. For travelers, it unfolded one morning at a time through aching distances, crowded markets, uncertain weather, and nights spent far from home. To understand what connected these civilizations, the journey must now leave emperors and famous names behind. What did an ordinary day actually feel like for someone living on the road? A merchant did not need to see the other end of the world for his goods to reach it. Before sunrise, somewhere along the immense networks later called the Silk Road, a caravan might begin preparing for another day's movement. The details varied greatly between regions and centuries, but the practical concerns remained familiar. Animals needed feeding and loading. Water had to be measured against the distance ahead. Food, clothing, equipment, and commercial cargo competed for limited carrying capacity. Every additional object added weight, and every mistake could become serious once the settlement behind had disappeared beyond the horizon. Different landscapes demanded different preparations. Bactrian camels, well suited to cold and dry environments, became important across parts of Central Asia, while horses, donkeys, mules, and other animals served travelers elsewhere. A caravan approaching a mountain pass faced conditions unlike one crossing a desert margin. Snow, steep paths, swollen rivers, intense heat, and seasonal winds could determine when movement was possible. Written accounts, administrative documents, archaeological remains, and surviving roadside infrastructure reveal that successful travel depended less upon romantic adventure than careful planning. Experienced guides understood landscapes that outsiders could easily misread. The familiar image of hundreds of camels traveling continuously between China and the Mediterranean can therefore be misleading. Some caravans certainly covered impressive distances, but many merchants operated across particular regions. Goods passed through repeated transactions and networks of intermediaries. Silk produced in China might be sold, transported onward, exchanged again, stored in another city, and eventually carried by people who knew little about those who had handled it before. Precious stones, spices, textiles, metals, glassware, and other commodities could move in similar ways. The object might complete a journey that none of its individual owners ever made. This relay-like system explains how distant societies could exchange materials without maintaining direct contact. A Roman buyer did not need to meet a Chinese silk producer. Between them stood merchants, translators, transporters, market officials, money changers, animal handlers, and communities maintaining roads and water supplies. Each participant understood only part of an enormous network, yet together they connected regions separated by mountains, deserts, and political frontiers. The Silk Road was created repeatedly through thousands of smaller journeys rather than one continuous stream moving across a continent. As daylight faded, practical concerns changed again. Animals that had carried goods since morning needed water, food, and rest. Travelers searched for secure places to sleep and information about the road ahead. In some regions, they might find established caravanserais or other inns. Elsewhere, shelter could be simpler and less certain. Goods needed protection, while strangers arriving from opposite directions brought rumors about weather, prices, officials, and danger. After hours of movement, different journeys briefly gathered beneath the same roof. What happened inside these resting places when the roads grew dark and the travelers finally stopped? After sunset, a roadside inn could briefly contain more of the world than many people would encounter in an entire lifetime. As daylight faded along a busy route, travelers searched for water, shelter, and a place where animals and goods could remain relatively secure. In many regions, caravanserais and other forms of roadside lodging answered these needs. Their architecture varied widely across centuries and landscapes. Some were substantial enclosed structures built around courtyards. Others offered simpler accommodation. They should not be imagined as identical stations evenly spaced across the Silk Road, but as part of a changing infrastructure that made difficult journeys more manageable. Inside a larger caravanserai, the day's movement slowly gave way to different kinds of activity. Camels and horses needed feeding and water. Packs were unloaded, valuable goods checked, and damaged equipment repaired. Merchants looked for secure storage or kept precious cargo close. Pilgrims, messengers, drivers, guards, officials, and travelers might occupy the same resting place for a night without sharing the same destination. Food was prepared, clothing shaken free of dust, and tired bodies settled after hours on the road. Archaeological remains and written accounts reveal how such stopping places could combine practical shelter with commercial and social functions. Yet their most valuable exchange could be invisible. Travelers arriving from opposite directions carried fresh information. One group might warn that snow had closed a mountain passage. Another could report fighting near a distant city or unusually high taxes at the next frontier. Merchants discussed prices and learned where certain goods were becoming scarce. News of a ruler's death, a damaged bridge, an unsafe road, or a profitable market could travel from conversation to conversation. Information moved almost like merchandise, except that it became more widely distributed every time someone repeated it. Such knowledge could change the direction of a journey. A merchant, hearing that demand had fallen in one market, might seek another. A caravan warned of danger could wait, hire additional protection, or choose a different road. Travelers therefore participated in an information network centuries before modern communication. No central authority directed it. Instead, countless conversations helped people respond to conditions beyond what they could personally see. The Silk Road depended not only upon roads and animals, but upon strangers trusting enough of what other strangers told them. Eventually, voices faded, animals settled, and darkness covered the courtyard. By morning, travelers would separate again, carrying goods and newly acquired knowledge in different directions. For centuries, networks survived because people continued finding reasons to make these journeys. But no system of exchange remains unchanged forever. Political centers shifted, markets evolved, maritime connections expanded, and ships increasingly moved large quantities of goods across enormous distances. The caravans did not suddenly vanish, nor did Central Asian commerce simply end. Something subtler happened. The ancient overland networks gradually lost some of their former importance. What changed when the world's busiest connections increasingly began turning toward the sea? Perhaps the greatest mystery of the Silk Road is that the people who traveled it never called it the Silk Road. Merchants leaving Samarkand, pilgrims approaching an oasis, or envoys crossing a mountain pass understood particular roads, destinations, markets, and political territories. They did not imagine themselves moving along one continuous highway connecting east and west. The familiar name appeared much later. In the 19th century, German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen used the term Seidenstraßen, or Silk Roads, when discussing routes associated with trade between China and Central Asia. A modern label eventually gave thousands of older journeys a convenient identity. That name can create another illusion, that a single road flourished for centuries and then suddenly disappeared. Historical evidence suggests something far more complicated. Individual routes repeatedly gained and lost importance as political conditions changed. Warfare could make one corridor dangerous while encouraging merchants to choose another. New dynasties altered taxation and security. Epidemics disrupted communities and movement. Rivers shifted, markets changed, and cities that had once prospered could decline, while other centers became more important. The network was constantly rearranging itself, just as it had since long before Zhang Qian traveled west. Maritime commerce also became increasingly significant. Ships could transport large quantities of cargo more efficiently than pack animals crossing mountains and deserts, while ports connected commercial networks stretching across the Indian Ocean and eventually far beyond it. Yet it would be misleading to imagine that ships simply killed the Silk Road at one identifiable moment. Overland commerce continued across Central Asia, serving regional markets and long-distance connections even as global patterns shifted. Cities such as Samarkand and Bukhara remained important centers under later rulers, while caravans continued carrying goods between communities that still depended upon inland routes. The Silk Road, therefore, had no single ending because it had never possessed a single beginning. It emerged gradually from older paths, changed whenever political and environmental conditions demanded, and consisted of overlapping networks rather than one fixed line. This also explains why no kingdom permanently controlled it. An empire might dominate one corridor for a generation, yet merchants could redirect movement, political borders could change, and distant markets could create new routes beyond imperial reach. The network survived precisely because it was flexible. Eventually, however, many places that had once belonged to these connections grew quiet. Desert sand entered abandoned houses around the Tarim Basin. Paintings disappeared beneath ruined walls. Documents remained sealed in forgotten spaces, while languages once spoken by merchants became known only through surviving texts. The routes continued changing, but parts of their history slipped from living memory. Centuries passed before explorers and archaeologists began returning to these landscapes, not carrying silk toward another market, but searching beneath the earth for evidence of worlds that had disappeared. What would they discover when the old roads became paths into the past? The road disappeared from maps long before its travelers disappeared from the earth beneath it. By the 19th century, scholars and explorers were becoming increasingly interested in the deserts, ruined cities, inscriptions, and ancient routes of Central Asia. Expeditions from Russia, Britain, Germany, France, Japan, Sweden, and other countries entered regions whose archaeological remains were still poorly understood outside local communities. During the following decades, discoveries from the Tarim Basin, Dunhuang, Samarkand, and many other places transformed knowledge of Eurasian history. The silent landscapes encountered by modern travelers began revealing evidence of civilizations connected across distances few historians had fully appreciated. The discoveries could be extraordinary. At abandoned desert settlements, researchers encountered wooden documents, textiles, paintings, coins, and household objects preserved by dry conditions. At Dunhuang, the famous library cave contained tens of thousands of manuscripts and paintings associated with a remarkable religious and cultural center. Texts survived in Chinese, Tibetan, Sogdian, Sanskrit, Old Turkic, and other languages, demonstrating that the routes across Inner Asia had carried far more than merchandise. Each language represented communities, beliefs, administrations, and intellectual traditions that had once overlapped across an enormous landscape. The Silk Road was slowly being reconstructed from fragments its travelers had unknowingly left behind. Yet this archaeological history is complicated. Early explorers worked during an age of imperial competition, when modern standards concerning excavation, ownership, and cultural heritage had not developed into their present forms. Important manuscripts, paintings, sculptures, and other objects were removed from archaeological contexts and transported to collections across Europe, Asia, and elsewhere. Some materials were documented or preserved through these expeditions, while their removal also separated objects from places and communities to which they belonged. The resulting collections remain valuable for scholarship, but they also raise continuing questions about ownership, access, preservation, and the history of archaeology itself. Modern research increasingly approaches these landscapes differently. Local archaeological institutions, international teams, conservators, historians, linguists, and scientists combine excavation with technologies capable of examining materials in new ways. Satellite imagery can reveal ancient settlement patterns and abandoned irrigation systems. Scientific analysis can investigate pigments, metals, textiles, food remains, and human mobility. Digital projects can reunite information from manuscripts and objects now scattered among distant collections without physically moving them again. Every technique adds another layer to a network whose complexity continues to grow. The great archaeological revelation is therefore not a single treasure. It is the realization that the Silk Road must be reconstructed from thousands of fragments scattered across deserts, ruined cities, archives, and museums. And the more evidence appears, the harder it becomes to imagine one kingdom commanding the whole system. Different powers controlled different places, while merchants, pilgrims, nomads, and ordinary communities kept connections alive between them. After centuries of conquest and exchange, the original mystery returns with greater force. If no empire permanently possessed these roads, who actually ruled the Silk Road? After centuries of searching for the kingdom that ruled the Silk Road, history offers an unexpected answer. There was never only one. The Han dynasty extended its influence toward Central Asia, seeking alliances, horses, and strategic advantage. Sogdian merchants created commercial communities thousands of kilometers from home. Kushan rulers governed crossroads connecting Central and South Asia. Oasis kingdoms controlled precious water beside dangerous deserts. Islamic states incorporated older routes into wider commercial and intellectual networks, while the Mongols eventually brought enormous territories beneath related systems of rule. Each became powerful within part of the network. None permanently possessed the whole. Geography made complete control almost impossible. A ruler could guard a mountain pass without determining prices in a distant market. An oasis kingdom could tax travelers who needed its water but could not command the grasslands beyond the desert. Nomadic powers could dominate sections of the steppe, while settled cities controlled workshops, storage, and agriculture. Even enormous empires depended upon local knowledge. Guides understood difficult terrain. Merchants maintained trusted relationships. Translators crossed linguistic boundaries, and communities kept wells, markets, roads, and resting places functioning. Power was distributed among people whose roles rarely appeared together in royal chronicles. The merchants themselves possessed another kind of authority. Sogdian networks demonstrated that influence could spread without territorial conquest. Their communities connected distant markets because they understood languages, customs, credit, and commercial relationships. Yet merchants also depended upon rulers for security and upon ordinary workers for transport. No caravan could move because of commerce alone. Animals required handlers. Travelers needed food. Irrigation sustained oasis settlements. Craftspeople produced goods worth exchanging. Information from strangers warned of danger ahead. The network existed because thousands of separate forms of knowledge supported one another. This may be the Silk Road's most important historical lesson. Its strength came from the same quality that prevented anyone from completely owning it. It was not a single road but a shifting collection of connections. When warfare closed one route, another might become more important. When kingdoms disappeared, merchants adapted to new authorities. When languages changed, ideas could survive through translation. Political control was temporary, while exchange repeatedly found new forms. So the kingdom promised by the mystery was never hidden beneath a forgotten desert. No lost superpower secretly ruled Eurasian trade. Instead, many kingdoms controlled fragments of a system larger than themselves. Their competition, cooperation, geography, and ordinary inhabitants collectively created what later generations would call the Silk Road. The rulers eventually disappeared, and the famous caravans became memories. But not everything they carried was lost. Religions had crossed mountains. Technologies had changed societies. Languages, foods, artistic traditions, manuscripts, and ideas had traveled beyond the borders where they began. The final question is therefore quieter than the first. If nobody truly owned the Silk Road, what part of it still remains in the world today? Perhaps the greatest legacy of the Silk Road belongs not to the emperors who tried to control it, but to the travelers whose names history never recorded. Tonight, across Central Asia, stars rise above mountain silhouettes, open grasslands, desert margins, and the remains of cities that once welcomed strangers from distant regions. The landscape appears quiet now, yet beneath that stillness lie traces of countless journeys. Footsteps crossed these valleys before the Silk Road had a name, and generations continued moving through them long after the kingdoms that guarded their roots had disappeared. Human societies were connected across astonishing distances, long before the modern world made such connections seem ordinary. Silk could move west through hands that never knew where its journey would end. Horses traveled toward markets and armies, far from the grasslands where they were raised. Buddhist teachings crossed mountain passes, while artistic traditions entered unfamiliar cities and changed as local craftspeople reimagined them. Technologies moved between cultures, texts passed from one language into another, and merchants built communities so far from home that their descendants sometimes belonged to several worlds at once. These exchanges did not create a single shared civilization. The people connected by the routes remained different in language, religion, politics, and daily life. That difference was part of what made exchange meaningful. A traveler arrived carrying something another community did not possess, whether an object, a technique, a story, or knowledge of distant events. Connections were created through millions of such encounters, most too ordinary to enter historical chronicles. An interpreter choosing the right words, a farmer supplying grain, or a guide remembering a hidden water source could contribute quietly to a network spanning continents. Modern archaeology continues recovering fragments of those forgotten connections. A wooden letter preserved by desert air can reveal someone waiting for news. A faded painting can show foreign envoys standing within a Sogdian hall. A coin can carry religious images across political boundaries. An abandoned irrigation channel can explain why a city once flourished and why it eventually became silent. None provides the entire story alone. Together, they remind historians that the past was often more connected, mobile, and complicated than surviving written histories suggest. The Silk Road was therefore never simply a road, it was a succession of choices made across generations, to travel, exchange, translate, negotiate, settle, adapt, and continue onward. Empires tried to command those movements, but no empire could own them forever. The travelers disappeared, yet their connections changed the societies left behind. Beneath the same ancient sky, ruined cities and silent paths still hold fragments of journeys whose destinations may never be known. And if one vast network could conceal so many forgotten kingdoms, languages, beliefs, and ordinary lives, perhaps the final mystery lies beyond the Silk Road itself. How many other ancient worlds are still waiting beneath landscapes that today seem completely silent?